Right, thanks. Actually, I've been trying to escape this panel yesterday and today. I'm so glad I am in this panel because I think I am so in tune with the themes that have come out of this. Now, let me explain that this is part of a wider project. As I reach the end of my academic career, my university, Leeds Beckett University, has decided that it needs to fulfil its target of having more members of staff with PhD. So they have personal development reviewed me into starting a PhD, which is a great opportunity for me. Gets me after some teaching, and got a student card, etc. Brilliant. And my topic is about the cultural politics of the left in the long 1960s. Yeah, actually, like Alan, I start 1956, finish 1976. My reason is actually the rise of punk, and I didn't really want to cope with...
I would mention that as well.
Yeah, I didn't want to cope with how the left responded to punk, which was very different. It's like, so that seems like you're right, that's a different phase. And what I'm attempting to do is look at the way in which the left, with its existing ideas and theories about class and organisation and change, was challenged by cultural developments in the 1960s, whether it's the rise of an even more commercialised, consumerist youth culture, the rise of the counterculture and the underground, and then the rise of identity politics in the form of gay liberation, feminism, those sorts of things. So this, about the dialectics of liberation, is a kind of component of that. And what I've got to say about it is, it's actually, was anyone other than Alan there?
Was anyone there? You were there.
I'm an old person.
I must talk to you about it. I frequently found people's memories of the event are a bit hazy. There was a heady aroma of something. There was music. So, but sorry, I was just slightly too young to make it. So, 2 weeks at the Roundhouse in Camden, organised by anti-psychiatrists, although R.D. Lang didn't really want to be categorised as an anti-psychiatrist. Others did. And it brought together members of the liberal and far left from across Europe and America with people from the counterculture. Jean-Paul Sartre was invited and was meant to come but didn't turn up. There's a whole list of great thinkers, Herbert Marcuse, Stokely Carmichael, etc., who were present. Okay. Partly, this is where I feel very much in tune with Madeline, is that I want to rescue the Dialectics of Liberation Congress and all the excitement and chaos that went along with it from the condescension of history and the condescension of the left. In part, that's because if you look at a book by, say, a good book, Chris Harman's The Fire Last Time, what he more or less says is, that was then, and everyone had forgotten it a year later, and it had no impact. Certainly the impact was pretty limited. There was another guy from the International Socialist tradition who was there, and is a sad, like Chris, a sad loss to the movement, I think. David Widgery wrote in Oz magazine a couple of years later, saying that the hippies are as capable of changing society as people who put foreign coins in gas meters. So you might not remember gas meters. So they do kind of dismiss the movement. Although David Widgery said he was bowled over by the event. Okay, so this is the fly posting that was done to advertise it. Presented itself as an anti-congress, and it does get some commemoration. In 2012, a Dialecticon, that's an actor reading out words by Stokely Carmichael, and an arty film a few years back, All Divided Selves, looking at R.D. Lang, and I think next year a film called Metanoia is coming out, which has got David Tennant playing R.D. Lang, so that was something. So, and I guess by 2017 there'll be more commemorations, etc. So there is some memory of it, which I'm glad about, but It's a contested memory. Now, I think to understand the events of the Dialectics of Liberation Congress, you do have to go back in time to see where some of the different components came from. I would emphasise the rise of poetry readings, that sort of cultural events. The great events, I think, is the 14-hour Technicolor Dream, which took place, I think it was a couple of years earlier. Mass audience in the Albert Hall of thousands of people listening to poetry performances, very radical poetry performances, Allen Ginsberg, etc., loads more. And actually, I don't have time to show all the clips I've assembled. A very interesting Man Alive programme about what is happening. Okay, so it is definitely situated in the emergence of the counterculture. They didn't call it the counterculture at the time. The phrase counterculture only really got used from about 1970. Theodore Roszak's book was the first use of it, or you can call it the underground. It didn't really have a name at the time. The name only came along later. So here's the Beatles, Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band cover, kind of like showing this, like the popularity of the counterculture. But this counterculture, I would say, goes back in time. You can take it back to the 17th century and the radical sectaries, the ranters, etc., and the Muggletonians. And E.P. Thompson did work in trying to show the connections between the 17th century and the end of the 19th century. I think William Blake is the great inspiring figure for this counterculture. And time and time again, you can go back to William Blake's poetry and his art, and actually you can find inspiration for this kind of spiritual longing that the counterculture was discovering, and its rejection of the kind of like drab institutions of ordinary society that is expressed through his work so much. And I think, just say Adrian Mitchell, continuing the poetic tradition. If we had more time, we could have a reading of the film about Vietnam, Tell Me Lies About Vietnam, etc. Brilliant poem. That's from, he was there at the Dialectics of Liberation. And okay, so the Royal Albert Hall International Poetry Incarnation, there's Allen Ginsberg at it. Great film about it, Peter Whitehead's Holy Communion, so that you can track these records down of the various performances. Another great poet, there he is, Michael Horowitz, talking to Allen Ginsberg, and I think there's the William Blake inspiration in the front cover for the poetry of the underground in Britain that Horowitz put together. Glad day that this movement represented. And you can also add radical theatre. Peter Brooks is Benefit of a Drought. Sorry, there's a performance of that on YouTube, which I'm not going to go through. If you look at my paper, I think there's probably all the links are available if you want to track these things. Actually, before I go on to Lawrence, I say that 1967 was enormously exciting. If you have a list of the political events that were going on, the anti-war protests starting to develop, the idea of actually human liberation via drugs and campaigns around drugs, campaigns around music and free love and ideals like that. It's a hugely exciting time. And the Dialectics of Liberation Congress keyed into that, and keyed into people who had been turned on by all that. David Widger, I'd say in his comments about the event, pointed out that there were strikes going on in London, important strikes going on, and there was no real connection between the counterculture approach and what was happening in terms of working class, industrial militancy, etc. So there was a kind of gap there. Okay, that's a good point from Widger. If you want another poetic implication of the movement, I think D.H. Lawrence's poem, The Sane Revolution, from 1928, I think, is a great document. It's like an inspiration. So this kind of captures the movement. It says, if you make a revolution, make it for fun. Don't make it in ghastly seriousness. Don't do it in deadly earnest. Do it for fun. And then if you look at the final verse, don't do it anyhow for international labour. Labour is the one thing a man has had too much of. Let's abolish labour. Let's have done with labouring where it can be fun and men can enjoy it. Then it's not labour, so let's have it so. Let's make a revolution for fun. Which isn't kind of maybe what you think about D.H. Lawrence, but that captures the kind of the attitudes of the counterculture. And there are various terms that you can use about it. It's clearly bohemian. Didn't believe in the normal, just like normal routines of life. Antinomian. The term antinomian goes back to 17th century debates in Christianity and can more or less mean what you want it to mean. But antinomian in context, I would say, means you don't have to obey other people's regulations because you are guided by an inner light, in the teachings of God, etc. It's inside you, so you should do what you want to do. Strongly millenarian, I think, as well, continuing the tradition going back to the 18th century, looking towards some sort of ending of the existing society and the start of a new society. Strongly Dionysian, rather than being Apollonian and like following reason, it's Dionysian and wants to follow spirit and exuberance and animal spirits, and hugely hedonistic as well. It's like, so, revolution for fun. Life should all be fun. And you can find all sorts of things. It fits in with the counterculture of the time. The human being at the start of 1967 is an inspiration. There's a whole, it's like the whole channel of thought coming from Timothy Leary and the idea of drugs as mind-blowing. The whole the slogan of turning on, tuning in, dropping out from Timothy Leary. Lots of these people turned out to be really rather dodgy later on, but they seemed pretty exciting at the time. Spontaneous. You might take Bob Dylan's lines, something's happening here, you don't know what it is, do you, Mr. Jones? It's like, as the challenge to straight society, it's like, what's the something happening? You don't know what it is. It was like, come and join us. The whole epoch of mysticism, partly from drugs, partly from the turn to the east, I think, which probably lies in the background to the whole hippie trail thing. That's part of a wider movement, and it's strongly taken up with the idea that politics isn't really about programs, but that politics should be an aesthetic experience. It's an aestheticization of politics. Ludic and Luddites as well. There's something else I want to emphasise, though, is that I think there's a strong libidinal component to this countercultural politics. It's distinctly, if you read Richard Neville, what Richard Neville says about sex, it's a bit, it's not politically correct in contemporary terms. So with the Reichian impulses that are around, so I mentioned W.R. Mysteries of the Organism yesterday. All you need is love. So if all you need is love, you don't need politics. You don't need to make any programs, and you can find all sorts of gibberish coming out of the movement. Just want to say a bit more in detail about the anti-psychiatry movement. There's a lot to be said about this. It's basically the idea that madness is social, it's a product of labelling and bad social relationships, in particular family relationships, that the clinical view of madness is part of a mechanism of social control. William Blake thought similar things about madness. He thought madness was a heightened experience, and you can situate it in all sorts of movements critiquing psychiatric practices. From the right wing, Thomas Saz's myth of mental illness is an important component of this. R.D. Lang himself played an important role in getting Michel Foucault translated into English and started writing about him and getting him into New Left Review, so that's an important connection. So, you're familiar with R.D. Lang and his importance. So I won't go through all his different writings. Less well known is probably David Cooper. Described himself as an existential Marxist. They wrote a book about Sartre's critique of dialectical reason. What I'd actually emphasise about David Cooper was that as a practitioner, he was attempting to bring new methods of psychiatric treatment, anti-psychiatric treatment, into the National Health Service in quite a revolutionary way. So I think he's an important figure in all this. The anti-psychiatry, the movement in this country depended a lot on a younger generation of psychiatrists who don't get much recognition, in particular Joseph Burke, who was 28 in 1967. He was the guy who actually organised the Congress rather than R.D. Lang or David Cooper, etc. So they're also working on an anti-University of London, which lasted for a few years on a small scale. So there's a movement around R.D. Lang. In particular, at Kingsley Hall in London, it's probably now perhaps famous for Mary Barnes's artistic work. Mary Barnes became a gifted artist. She was going through schizophrenia, and R.D. Lang and the others, they thought that the best way to help Mary Barnes was to help her through it, rather than cure it, but to help her through it into a better plane of existence, which had its embarrassing downsides, if you know the case of Mary Barnes. David Edgar wrote a good play about the Mary Barnes experience. So, a quote from Morton Chatsman about what was going on at Kingsley Hall for 3.5 years. Kingsley Hall was a kind of centre for the counterculture and the left, and all sorts of people would drop in there, and they say that Ronald's son, Adrian Lang, makes a point in here somewhere saying what it was like. No patients, no doctors, no white coats, no mental illness, no schizophrenia. Together. Visitors became increasingly frequent and celebrated. Kenneth Tynan dropped in, David Mercer, Timothy Leary, Sean Connery. Sean Connery had been persuaded by his wife at the time to go along and talk about his issues. So there's a kind of celebrity thing about Kingsley Hall as well as kind of generally trying to help people through their experiences. And anti-psychiatry enters the culture in a huge way. There's in Malcolm Bradbury's rather unpleasant, nasty novel, The History Man, which is an attack on the left. It's the point in there is that you can identify someone on the left, because they've got R.D. Lang in their house. So, sorry, the books rather than. And that works out in. I'm a big fan of Ken Loach, but there's one Ken Loach film I'm never going to watch again, which is Family Life, because it is so depressing. You see it also in first of all a TV play, 1964, can't be right, that's maybe the original document. A bit later on the film, Morgan, A Simple Case for Treatment, expresses these ideas. So then the Congress, so the anti-psychiatrists put this together, a clan gathering, a being, etc. Okay, running out of time for what it was like. I've got a list of speakers, and I'm just going to flick through them because I don't have time to tell you what's interesting about them. From Herbert Marcuse. I'm going in age order as they get younger. C.L.R. James, Gregory Bateson, Jules Henry, Henry is forgotten now. Paul Sweezy, the most handsome Marxist of the 20th century. Paul Goodman, Lucien Goldman, Ernest Mandel. Can you notice what social group is missing? Allen Ginsberg, John Garassi, Stokely Carmichael. Stokely Carmichael was the star and the most controversial person there. And Stokely Carmichael, what Stokely Carmichael was doing, he hated it, but what he was doing there was important in all sorts of different histories. The finished by reading out this great poem saying, "We have found you out, four-faced farmers, we've found you out, four-faced America, we have found you out." So, Stokely Carmichael, his poems as well. Emmett Brogan, he's from the San Francisco Diggers, not the Counterculture. The story he tells is that he read out this rousing speech calling for revolution, and the audience said, "Hey!" And at the end he said, "Hitler wrote that." No one has corroborated that, so I don't know if anyone saw, but so it's a kind of typically self-aggrandizing performance.
So you were there. No, I didn't go to that session.
Karen, doing the music. Herbert Marcuse, I'm told, couldn't really speak because there was so much disruption. He did contribute. There is a speech by him, which I don't.
He couldn't deliver it.
Which actually talks about the calm of the occasion, which clearly wasn't, and
well,
the music of Mick Farren and the Social Deviants being played. So there's just one final point, is that I do think we shouldn't just dismiss this whole experience, this whole encounter between the hard political left with their programmes and strategies and the chaotic, eccentric, inconsistent counterculture. But the male libidinal principle that seems to be there, I think, is important, and it's something worth remembering and criticising the counterculture for, because it did seem so much for men, and the women were just chicks, and everything that goes along with that. And I think you can find all sorts of feminist critiques of the absence of gender as an issue, the absence of women, the absence of any sign of feminism, and so that is an important contribution. Angela Davis was there, and clearly there were other women there, but you won't find many of them on the speakers panel. And I think from some accounts, the male domination of the Congress was an important impetus to the development of the women's liberation movement in this country, as women got fed up with just the men speaking about it. So there's a photograph of people participating, but it was huge. So I think it's worth recovering. And I'll finish there. There's more to be said, much more to be said about it, but thank you.